Welcome to Coffee Christianity. Today I'll be interviewing three pastors, Emily, Josh, and Mike, about mental health and the church. If you like the video, please hit the like button and make sure to subscribe for more great content. Let's begin. Hello, and welcome to another week of Coffee Christianity. Today we're going to be dealing with questions that were given to us online, and I'm really excited to start. My name is Brendan, and I serve as a church planter in New Jersey. And I'm going to go on ahead and let each person introduce themselves. Emily, do you want to go first?
Sure. My name is Emily, and I serve resourcing churches in my area, and I also serve in the local church leading.
How
Oh,
about you? Oh,
my favorite coffee that I've ever had. Um, that's a hard one. I love all coffee, but I think my favorite is just when I'm at home at my parents' house and they make a nice big French press. It just feels like home to me.
that's great. Thanks. Josh, how about you?
Yeah, so my name is Josh. I am the senior pastor at the United Methodist Church at Milltown, which is just outside of New Brunswick. And my favorite cup of coffee is really any cup of coffee, but I like to have a cup of coffee down at the shore with my family when we all get together in the morning and watch the sunrise. So,
That's good. Mike, how about you?
Mike Capron. I'm the pastor of the First Presbyterian Church of Elmwood Park with a wonderful group of people there. And I'm not a coffee guy, but I like chai. And fun fact, the secret ingredient to a really good cup of chai is bay leaf.
Oh, interesting.
Interesting.
I'm going to have to try that. And I will be the host for today as we look at some questions. Our first question for today is mental illness and the church. We had a lot of questions about how does the church handle mental illness? How do we think about mental illness as Christians? And what role does mental health have in ministry settings at church? So I want to open up the conversation. If anyone has any thoughts or ideas about or experiences with mental illness in the church, I'd love to hear what you all have to say about it.
I have a story I could open up with.
Great.
God showed up in my church one Sunday whom I hadn't met before, but some of the people in the church knew him. And he was kind of a tall guy, and he had some odd prayer requests when we came to that part of the service. He felt that there was like evil in a certain part of his body. I think in that case it was his arm, and he wanted prayer that evil would leave. And as I've gotten to know him a bit over the past couple of years, he tells me that he's diagnosed with schizophrenia. He's never caused any kind of trouble. I'm always glad to see him when he shows up. And once in a while, he comes to my office for some pastoral care and prayer, sometimes about a body part. And one of the things that I've learned is that there's no point in arguing with him about whether there actually is or is not evil in the body part. For him, due to the way his mind works, there is. And when he asks for prayer for something like that, I just pray for it. And that's just fine. And I feel showing that kind of love and acceptance of somebody is a good way for a church to be.
Yeah, I don't even know where to start, but I have a lot of thoughts on this. I think generally, the church is not one thing. There's lots of different kinds of churches, of course. So I think a lot of churches are on the books. They're very supportive of people with mental illness. They are welcoming. But what that actually translates into in terms of supporting people with mental illness sometimes isn't as strong. So I think there is often a feeling of, oh, this person's acting weird, or I don't want to, they're making other people feel uncomfortable. So let's kind of usher them out of the space. And of course, if someone's being a danger to themselves or others, you don't want them in a space with other people. But I think that I think that the church does a lot better talking about mental illness than acting. So I took a course on mental illness in ministry. And one of the things we talked about a lot was mental illness is not a casserole disease or a casserole illness. So someone gets cancer, or someone has a heart attack or whatever. The church rallies around and brings casseroles to their family so that they don't have to cook for themselves and that kind of thing. But if someone has a mental breakdown, or like even a chronic long-term mental illness, there isn't that same kind of rallying around and support. And in part, I think that's because of the broader culture. There's still a shame and stigma around it. So people don't really know how to interact and care for people with mental illness in the same ways as other illnesses and challenges that people do deal with.
Yeah, so I'm going to piggyback off of Emily here, because I think she hit the nail on the head. My short answer is the church doesn't, which is why I went and got my Master's of Divinity in Marriage and Family Therapy, because Emily hit it right on the head. The church on paper does a great job of saying they handle mental illness, but when push comes to shove, and you're actually dealing with people, it gets very, very difficult. And honestly, the church oftentimes with actions, from my experience, because I tend to come from an evangelical background, and there's nothing wrong with that, the approach is more suck it up, buttercup. And I use that phrase specifically because, not that I have heard clergy use that, but I've heard them use terminology more Christian-like of suck it up, buttercup. It's not a matter of suck it up, buttercup. It's a matter of walking alongside and being with people and helping them get the help that they actually need. But in order to do that, we as pastors and clergy in the church need to help people understand that it's okay to deal with their emotions. And so what I did was generate a sermon series around the Pixar movie Inside Out, and help people understand that there is all of these different emotions, and that it's okay to handle these different emotions, and that mental illness is very much a real thing. It's not just this hoax that's made up, and that we as church people and as Christians need to walk alongside people and understand that when people are asking for help, they're not just making something up, but that it's a very, very real thing. And it was an overwhelmingly positive sermon series, and people began to think of family members that maybe need help, and people at work and within the community that needed help. We've been able to partner up with our community to be able to do that.
So I'm hearing a lot of, there's actually a lot of experience in our Zoom roundtable with mental illness. Mike was saying that he's had some congregants who are struggling with schizophrenia. Emily, Josh, you both have studied this it sounds like fairly extensively. And so I've got some stories to tell too, but I'm curious to know more. It sounds like in a lot of cases, the church kind of botched this and is still botching it. Maybe not in every case. It sounds like Mike's church, they're doing some constructive stuff. Josh, you've been preaching on it. So my first question is, what do we do with the question of faith and mental illness? So I've had people ask me, well, if God's real, won't God heal me for this, through this? And should I really take my medication? Or is that actually a lack of faith? And I mean, I've had people cry and be really upset. It's like a real important question. So that's my first question. I'd love to hear, has that ever happened in your settings? And how do you respond to that question? Are you faithful if you're also seeking help for mental health?
So I'll go first here, because I preached the sermon series on mental illness, and that came up often. And I simply responded that you trust me as your pastor to be a spiritual guide. So why in the world, if God has created people that have gone into the profession of helping us with mental illness, we trust doctors, right? We trust doctors to be able to help us. We don't do our own surgeries. When we need a knee replacement, we need a hip replacement, we need these things that we just can't do. We trust the surgeons. It's okay that there's medical advancements. My firm belief is that, God can utilize science as well. God is behind a lot of things, and that's okay. So please, by all means, take medication. If you stop it, it's not going to be good. That's my short answer.
I love it. Does anyone else have any thoughts on it?
Yeah, I think that I totally agree with Josh that God works through all sorts of different media, whether that's other people, medication, science, church, prayer, all sorts of different ways. I think one of the challenges with mental illness is that it's mental. So there is as soon as you start to feel better, you think, okay, maybe I don't need this medication anymore. And you go off it, and then there's a cycle. And I speak also from personal experience as well, someone who has struggled with mental illness. Particularly, I have had one experience of psychosis, and I will tell you it's the most terrifying thing I've ever experienced. And I'm really thankful that I've only experienced it once. But if someone is in a state where they are having a break with reality, they might not be open to hear the pastoral advice of continuing your medication, whatever. And I think as pastors and leaders, we can only do so much. Like, I don't want to say we can only do so much, but we can only, encourage people to the extent that they allow us to have influence in their lives. And I think it's important for pastors to not take on the responsibility of feeling guilty if the person then decides not to take their medication or something like that. So yeah, I basically just agree with Josh, but I'm just rambling. But I think that a lot of people want healing for various things in their lives, and there's nothing wrong with praying for healing, as long as it's recognized that healing comes in a whole bunch of different ways. And there are people who have physical illnesses who wonder if it's some sort of punishment, and maybe I have this because I wasn't faithful enough. And I think a similar approach to people who are struggling with mental illness to seek medical and professional help is in order from the church.
Thanks for being courageous and sharing about that.
Oh, I consider it, thank you. I consider it part of my, my calling to be honest about those things and try and dismantle a bit of the stigma. So.
Yeah, I really appreciate you opening that door, because I think one thing I've noticed about the conversation with mental health in the church is that pastors hardly ever talk about the mental health of pastors. We're almost always focused on the congregations, or as a religious leader, we might think of whoever we're leading. But it seems like from the stats that I've read, pastors overwhelmingly deal with mental health issues, especially, so for example, depression. And I personally am constantly grappling with struggling through depression. And I'd love to hear more about how mental health has played into your personal ministries even. So for me, the theology that I've studied, the questions I'm asking about the universe and myself tend to be rooted in some of the saddest points of my life. So the depression, in other words, is like a huge springboard for the theological work that I do. So I'm reading like really emo, macabre people like Kierkegaard or whoever, all these like existentialist questions. And being honest and open about that, I think, is really helpful. So Emily, thank you for sharing. Is there any other ways that mental health has played into your personal understanding of leadership or of theology, or even why you're doing what you're doing today?
think it's an interesting question how much pastors share and for what purpose they share. I think I've heard of pastors who sort of try to use their congregation as a mental health support group, and that's just not appropriate. In our role as leaders, it's critical for us to develop our own support systems outside of our congregation, where we can get the kind of help that we need. And I remember attending a lecture on leadership once where they talked about how good leaders function. And what they said is that good leaders selectively reveal their weaknesses.
Mm-hmm.
You have to say enough about your struggles to help people connect with you and trust you that you have struggles and you're like them. But you don't want to share so much that you lose kind of respect. And you have to be aware that what you share, if there's somebody out there who's kind of trollish in either an in-person or internet setting, it may come back and get used against you.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I suspect that my viewpoint may represent a slightly older generation than the other folks on this call, but that's kind of my perspective. I see younger colleagues generally much more open about what's going on with them than I'm accustomed to being.
Mike, that's such a great point. It reminds me of a preaching professor I had that said, the moment your sermon turns into a therapy session, you've done it wrong. So I love that there's that pendulum of like, you can be too stoic and not share anything, or you can use your church or group as like a processing platform, which could really be disastrous as well. So that's an important balance to think about.
Yeah, I appreciate what Mike said, because along the lines of Emily, I battle OCD. That's something that is a daily battle for me, and so much so that it's included in my ordination paperwork, because it's something that you have to, like Mike, you pointed out, you have to decide kind of who you're opening that door to, right? But when I was preaching this sermon on mental illness, I'm not broadcasting, right? I'm not turning it into this therapy session to everybody. But if people ask because they're coming to me because they're struggling with stuff, if it's people that I can trust, that I knew that were genuinely needing help, or we're trying to find a way to cry out for help, then it's a tool that I have. Because what I like to remind people when I sit down and do therapy with them, battling mental illness is like a bath toy where whatever you're struggling with will constantly rise to the surface. And this is going back to that point about why we need to take our medication and different things like that. And what Emily brought up, that prayer is helpful, all of these things, surrounding yourself with people who care. In order for that flotation device and to go below the surface, to make it easier to manage and deal with, you need as many hands as possible to push it down. Because if you don't have things pushing it down, whatever it is that you're dealing with is going to rise to the surface automatically. It's not something that just goes away. So we need all of those things, but you have to be careful who you're asking to help you push down that flotation device. You have to be very, very careful.
I would add that I definitely feel comfortable in this forum sharing what I shared, but it's not something I get up in front of my church and talk about. It's not something I would lie about or hide. If I was asked by somebody about it, if they, stumbled across this, I would gladly, discuss in probably little detail the situation. But I think it's a matter of, being prudent, being wise about when we bring these things up and how. I would also say that something I hear a lot in terms of advice for preaching is to speak from a scar and not a wound. So I think that's important. If a pastor's still really working out something for their own mental health, or even, in their own personal life that's unrelated to mental health, then I think it can be damaging for both the pastor and the congregation to just, let that wound like bleed and ooze all over the place, to make it graphic. But if there's some critical distance and there's some ability to reflect back on an experience and see what maybe some of its meaning is in the broader scope of one's life, I think that can be helpful. Again, as Mike and Josh both said, with taking care that you're not using your congregation or your group that you're leading as a self-help kind of forum. Yeah.
So if I'm hearing all of you guys correctly, or as we say in the South, all y'all correctly, maybe that's some helpful steps in engaging with mental illness is one, deal with your own stuff, go seek help professionally with your things, so that you can differentiate, you can have a little distance with the people that are also having struggles with mental health, whatever that looks like. And then the second thing I'm hearing is building a coalition. So having a team of people, and the more people that are wise and helpful, not like crazy codependent, like bad situations, but actually like people who can really walk alongside of you. Whether that's having a pastor in your corner so you can deal with sort of grounding yourself spiritually, and then also some kind of therapist or some sort of medical professional who understands the biology and the deep neurological aspect to it, is helpful. So I think those are some really good steps. And this leads me to the second question I had, which is, what are some ways that we can, like, if we had to imagine a church doing this right, if we could paint a picture of what it looks like to be a religious community handling mental illness well, what would that church, that space look like?
I have another story from another church. So this was a congregation in a small town that didn't really have homeless people in it. So this story doesn't transfer to major urban environments, but it became known in this church. We realized that somebody who'd grown up in the church and gone away was secretly living in the church. And that this person was bipolar and not taking medication. And I was very proud of the way this congregation handled that. We were able to, bring together the set of folks who were like, you can't have someone living in the church. It's not safe. It's probably against the law. With the people who were like, we got to love our neighbors ourselves. What are we going to do? Kick this person out? We know him. He grew up here. And there were people who had mental illness, especially one woman who was bipolar, who kind of came alongside him and talked to him about her experience. And people started taking him to doctor's appointments. Somebody took him to apply for some government assistance. And that was a new experience for that person. And eventually he got on some medication, and we found a place for him to live, and he moved out of the church. And I feel pretty proud of that story and the way that congregation helped this person in a balanced way. That wasn't the end of all his problems. He had more stuff that happened, later on in life. And last I heard, he was doing okay, but it's been a lot of serious ups and serious downs. But I like the way we did that.
Yeah, so I think Mike just knocked it out of the park. When the church moves from loving the building to loving the people, that's when the church is doing it right with mental illness. Because so often what happens is, and when I say loving the building to loving the people, I mean the imagery of how this impacts their church, their building, as opposed to what it looks like to actually love the person that is involved in this situation.
Right.
That's when the church is handling mental illness right. And the church has a long way to go in this. And this goes back to what, Emily said a little while ago, that on paper, the church gives a lot of money to these, all of them. Push comes to shove, and Sally shows up on a Tuesday afternoon, or on a Sunday morning. Oh boy, what are we going to do? And so, Mike, I think you just hit a home run. It involves not loving the building and loving the person.
I would also say that I think the work that Josh did in preaching that sermon series is important. I think creating a culture in the church where people are invited to bring their vulnerabilities in an appropriate manner to the community, but not just creating a space for people with mental illnesses or mental health challenges to bring to, but also creating a culture where the other people in the church are prepared to respond. So creating groups, or just working on discipleship with people where there's not just sort of this reactive, like, oh my gosh, what do we do with this person? And mental illness doesn't always look like something that you would react horribly to either. But, bringing up Christians who can deal with their own reactions to mental illness, I think it would be, in an ideal world, what I would love to see the church doing.
So it sounds like,
sorry, I should also add, with that series that we did, the other part of it, to engage people in conversation, because I think that's the other important part of this, is we showed the movie Inside Out, but rather than charging people to come, we had them, we found out what, I forget the name of the ministry that we helped, what they needed. So the admission was for people to make donations of actual items. And it was a lot of, we're blessed to have many young families at our church. We're a church that's growing, that has grown that way. But we also had a lot of older folks that had never seen this movie, that Pastor Josh has preached on now for 3 weeks, that they want to see what this movie is about. So it opened it up for people to engage in conversation as they're doing shopping, then also at that movie night, as they're packing up bags for people, and they're putting all of this together. It created this culture of conversation, which was really, really important.
That's great. So in addition to sort of building the teams, in addition to having folks deal with their own stuff in a helpful and constructive way, it also sounds like we got to normalize the conversations in a church that's doing this well. Have these conversations rolling, have it be normal for people to think about mental health, and also do what churches do best, which is like have these wraparound services, which is, I see all the time people volunteering to pick up groceries or drive someone to the doctor or whatever. And, or even to think of mental illness more as that casserole situation where people are like, oh, actually, bipolar disorder means that some weeks people aren't eating. So how do we create a casserole chain or whatever that looks like? How do we support parents by looking after their kids or whatever that is? And I love what you all have been hinting at, which is respecting a person as a person and seeing their mental illness as simply a facet of who they are, which is they are a dignified human being who needs love and care and deserves respect, even if sometimes the things they say don't match the reality we understand. So I really appreciate all of your input on mental health in the church. We'll pause here and then get going with the next question.